The late afternoon sun hung low over Los Angeles, painting the hazy sky in hues of orange and red. Smoke drifted lazily across the hills, a haunting reminder of the wildfires tearing through the region. Sirens wailed in the distance, blending with the chaotic symphony of helicopters and the crackling roar of approaching flames. Amid the chaos, Marcus Hall, a tall, steady man with a firefighter's calm and an unmistakable sense of purpose, maneuvered his pickup truck through narrow, smoke-choked streets. His mission was clear: evacuate the children stranded in a local community center before the encroaching flames make it impossible. For Marcus, this wasn't just a job. It was personal. These were his people, his community. He'd spent years as a firefighter, and now as a fire chief, safeguarding lives and mentoring young volunteers. Today, though, he was dressed in plain clothes. No helmet, no badge, just a simple hoodie and jeans that didn't betray his rank or experience. The tension was palpable as Marcus turned onto a residential street, now eerily deserted. He spotted the community center at the end of the block. A few parents and volunteers frantically herding children into waiting cars. He waved out the window, signaling that he was there to help. Without hesitation, he jumped out of his truck and began assisting, guiding terrified kids to safety. The air was thick with urgency and the acrid smell of smoke. Marcus didn't have time to think about anything else but getting everyone out. But as he helped a tearful little boy into a car, blue and red lights suddenly flashed behind him. 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt, and officers spilled out, their faces tight with suspicion. Marcus froze, his heart sinking as he saw their hands rest on their holsters. "Hey!" Step away from the vehicle. One of them barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus raised his hands, confused but calm. "I'm just helping evacuate the kids," he explained. The second officer stepped closer, his gaze narrowing as he took in Marcus' appearance. "We got reports of someone suspicious in the area." "You match the description," he said, his tone cold and pointed. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "There's nothing suspicious about saving kids from a wildfire," he said, glancing at the line of cars filled with frightened children and parents. But the officers didn't budge. One of them walked around the truck, inspecting it as if it was stolen property. "What are you doing out here, dressed like this?" the first officer demanded, his voice laced with skepticism. Marcus clenched his jaw, fighting the frustration bubbling up inside him. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before, felt it before. But now wasn't the time to make it about him. "Listen," he said firmly but evenly. "I'm here because there are kids in danger. The fire's moving fast. We don't have time for this." The officer raised a hand to silence him, ignoring Marcus's plea. Instead, he asked for ID. Marcus hesitated. His fire chief credentials were in his truck, but the growing urgency of the air told him every second mattered. Before he could respond, the other officer radioed in, describing Marcus and his truck. Parents and volunteers nearby watched anxiously, their faces etched with fear and confusion. Marcus's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm the fire chief for the district," he said. "You can call my station to confirm." The officers exchanged a look, clearly doubting his words. One of them smirked, shaking his head. "Fire chief." "Right," he muttered, his tone dripping with disbelief. The standoff felt like it stretched forever, the seconds ticking by painfully slowly. The distant roar of the fire was growing louder now, and the smoke thickened with every passing moment. And then, as if on cue, a frantic voice crackled over Marcus's handheld radio, which was clipped to his truck. "Chief Hall, do you copy? We've got a flare-up near your location. Evacuate immediately." The officers froze, their eyes darting to the radio and back to Marcus. Marcus held their gaze, his voice unwavering. "You still think I'm lying?" Marcus didn't lower his eyes as the officers stood frozen, their authority momentarily rattled. The voice on the radio was unmistakable, a calm, commanding tone from the operations base. His name, Chief Hall, was clear as day. But instead of acknowledging it, the officers glanced at each other, clearly weighing whether to double down or back off. "Pick up the radio," one of them finally said, his voice less confident than before. Marcus's jaw tightened. His radio was clipped to the door frame of his truck, just a few steps away. "Fine," he said, moving cautiously, his hands still raised slightly to avoid giving them any excuse to escalate. The parents and children nearby watched in tense silence, the thick smoke and flashing lights adding to the surreal scene. When Marcus reached the radio, he pressed the button firmly. "This is Chief Hall," he said. "I'm on site, trying to clear evacuees, but I've been stopped." There was a pause, followed by a curt reply from the other end. "Chief, we need you to move now. The wind's shifted. The fire is heading your way fast. You've got less than 10 minutes to clear that block." Marcus's eyes flicked back to the officers, who were now shifting uncomfortably. The older one, a stocky man with a greying mustache, stepped forward. "If you're really the fire chief, where's your ID? Why aren't you in uniform?" Marcus stared him down, his tone sharp but controlled. "Because I came straight from home when I heard about this. There wasn't time to suit up." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You want to waste more time questioning me, or do you want to help save lives?" The younger officer, who had been silent until now, glanced nervously at the thickening smoke. "Look, maybe we should just—" "We're following procedure," the older one snapped, cutting him off. But even his voice faltered slightly as the fire's rumble grew louder, the ominous sound of destruction creeping closer. Marcus stepped forward, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. "I don't need your permission to do my job. If you're not going to help, get out of the way." Before the older officer could respond, the sound of panicked shouting drew everyone's attention. A woman from the community center was running toward them, waving her arms. "There's more kids inside. We can't get them out." Marcus didn't wait for the officer's reaction. He was already moving, his focus shifting back to what mattered. "Stay here and make sure the road stays clear," he called over his shoulder, not caring whether they'd listen. Inside the community center, the air was stifling, the smoke seeping in through cracks in the doors and windows. Marcus found a small group of children huddled in a corner, their faces streaked with tears and soot. A young volunteer, barely out of her teens, was trying to comfort them, her own fear barely concealed. "We need to move now," Marcus said firmly. He crouched down, his voice softening as he addressed the kids. "Hey, I know it's scary, but I'm here to help. We're going to get you somewhere safe, okay?" One little girl, clutching a stuffed animal, nodded hesitantly. Marcus scooped her up, motioning for the others to follow. The volunteer gathered the remaining children, and they made their way toward the exit, the heat pressing in like a physical weight. Outside, the scene was even more chaotic. Ash fell like snow, coating cars and sidewalks. The parents who had evacuated earlier were shouting, their voices frantic as they searched for their children. Marcus emerged from the building carrying the little girl and was immediately surrounded by relieved families. The officers, meanwhile, stood awkwardly by their cruisers, watching the scene unfold. The younger one finally spoke up, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Maybe we were wrong," he muttered. The older officer didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, who was already moving back toward the building. "Chief Hall, what's the status?" The radio crackled again, the urgency in the dispatcher's voice unmistakable. Marcus grabbed it as he jogged back to his truck. "I've got most of them out, but we're not done yet. The fire's moving fast. I need backup now." "We're sending another team your way, but they're still 10 minutes out," the dispatcher replied. "You're on your own until then." Marcus set the radio down and turned back toward the community center, his mind racing. 10 minutes felt like an eternity when the fire was this close. As he reached the building, the older officer finally approached him, his face grim. "What can we do to help?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Grab those parents and volunteers and start directing traffic. Get these cars moving so we can clear the street." He paused, his tone hardening. "And if you're going to help, stay out of my way." The officer nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his face. Understood. The next few minutes were a blur of motion. Marcus made another pass through the building, checking every room and calling out to make sure no one was left behind. Outside, the officers and volunteers worked together, organizing the evacuees and directing them to safety. But the fire was relentless. The heat was almost unbearable now, the smoke so thick it was hard to breathe. As Marcus exited the building for the final time, he spotted flames licking the edge of the street, their eerie glow casting long shadows across the chaos. The sound of distant sirens signaled the arrival of more fire crews, but Marcus knew it would be close. Too close. He climbed into his truck, ready to lead the final convoy of evacuees out of the danger zone. And then, just as he started the engine, a piercing scream cut through the air. The scream froze Marcus in place. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he was out of the truck and running, his boots pounding against the ash-covered pavement. The sound had come from the far side of the building, where the fire had gained the most ground. As he rounded the corner, he saw her, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, trapped against the side of the building. Flames roared just feet away, blocking her path to safety. She clung to a child, shielding him with her body, as if sheer willpower could keep the fire at bay. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward them, the heat hitting him like a wall. "It's okay," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "I'm here. We're getting out of this." The woman's tear-streaked face turned toward him, her eyes wide with terror and relief. "We can't move," she cried. "The fire, it's everywhere." Marcus scanned the scene, his mind racing. The fire had crept closer than he realized, cutting off the direct path back to the street. His radio crackled to life, but he ignored it, his focus on the woman and child. "Hold on to me," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're going to run through it, but you have to trust me." The woman nodded, clutching the boy tighter. Marcus positioned himself between them and the flames, his body acting as a shield. Then he took a deep breath and led them forward, each step feeling like a battle against the heat and smoke. The air burned his lungs, and the acrid smell of burning wood and debris was suffocating. But he pushed forward, his mind focused on one thing, getting them to safety. Finally, they broke through the wall of heat and stumbled onto the street, where a group of parents and volunteers rushed to meet them. Marcus helped the woman and child into waiting arms, his body sagging with exhaustion as the adrenaline began to wear off. But there was no time to rest. The fire was dangerously close now, and the evacuation wasn't over yet. He turned back toward the building, only to find the older officer standing in his path. "You can't go back in there," the officer said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "It's too dangerous." Marcus stared at him, his jaw tightening. There might still be people inside. The officer shook his head. "We've cleared the area. Everyone who's accounted for is out. You've done your job, Chief." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew the officer was right. The flames had fully engulfed the back half of the building, and the structure was starting to groan under the strain. Any more time spent inside would be suicide. Instead, Marcus turned his attention to the remaining evacuees, ensuring everyone was accounted for and directing them towards safety. The younger officer had taken charge of the traffic, guiding cars down the narrow street as efficiently as possible. But as Marcus watched, a sense of unease crept over him. The fire was moving faster than anticipated, its flames licking at the edges of the street. The evacuees were still too close, their vehicles barely crawling through the gridlock. He grabbed his radio, his voice urgent. "This is Chief Hall. We need immediate air support. The fire's jumped the line and is heading toward the evacuees." The dispatcher's reply crackled through the static. "Copy that, Chief. Helicopters are en route, but they're still 5 minutes out." Marcus swore under his breath. 5 minutes might as well have been an eternity in these conditions. He turned to the officers and volunteers, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone needs to move now," he shouted. "If your car can't go, leave it behind and get on foot. The fire's too close. His words spurred the crowd into action, people abandoning their vehicles and grabbing what they could carry. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, and volunteers helped guide the elderly and injured. Through it all, Marcus stayed at the front, his presence a steadying force amidst the panic. The smoke was thicker now, reducing visibility to mere feet. The fire's roar was deafening, a constant reminder of the danger closing in around them. Then, just as the last of the evacuees reached the safer ground, Marcus heard a new sound. A sharp crack, followed by a deafening crash. He spun around just in time to see part of the community center's roof collapse, sending a shower of embers and debris into the air. The collapse sent a fresh wave of heat and smoke surging toward them, and Marcus barely had time to react. He grabbed a nearby child and shielded them with his body, the searing air scorching the back of his neck. When the wave passed, he looked up to see the helicopters finally arriving, their powerful rotors whipping the smoke into swirling eddies. The first drops of water cascaded down, quelling the flames closest to the evacuees and providing a temporary reprieve. But Marcus knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The fire was still raging, and the full scope of the destruction had yet to be revealed. As the crowd regrouped in a safer area, Marcus took a moment to catch his breath. He surveyed the scene, his mind racing with questions. How had the fire spread so quickly? Why had the initial response been so delayed? And most pressing of all, why had he been stopped in the first place? The officer's actions had nearly cost lives, and Marcus wasn't about to let that go unanswered. But those questions would have to wait. For now, there was still work to be done, and Marcus wasn't the type to stand down while there were lives to save. The situation was spiraling out of control. Marcus moved through the chaotic crowd, his sharp eyes scanning for anyone left behind. Every second mattered now. The fire roared louder with each gust of wind, and the air was heavy with smoke, making it hard to breathe. His lungs burned, but he forced himself to keep going. He spotted an elderly man struggling to keep up, clutching a small bag against his chest, as if it held his entire life. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted over, grabbing the man's arm to steady him. "Come on, sir. I've got you," Marcus said, his voice firm but reassuring. The man looked up at him with watery eyes, his face a mask of fear and exhaustion. I can't," the man stammered, his knees buckling under him. "Yes, you can." "We're almost there," Marcus replied, lifting the man onto his shoulder in one swift motion. The heat was unbearable now, sweat pouring down his face, but he pushed forward, one step at a time. As they reached the safer ground where evacuees were gathering, Marcus set the man down gently. A volunteer rushed over to assist, but Marcus was already turning back toward the danger. He couldn't stop. Not yet. The fire wasn't just a threat to property. It was alive, hungry, and unpredictable. It moved faster than anyone anticipated, jumping barriers and consuming everything in its path. The sound of its crackling fury was deafening, a constant reminder of how close it was. Marcus's radio crackled again. "Chief Hall, this is Air 1. We're running low on water. Do you have an updated priority target?" He looked around, assessing the situation. The evacuees were mostly out of immediate danger, but the fire was threatening to spread into the residential area. If that happened, dozens more lives would be at risk. "Focus on the north side," Marcus instructed. "We need to stop it before it hits the houses." "Copy that, Chief. North side priority," the pilot confirmed. Marcus watched as the helicopters moved into position, releasing massive torrents of water onto the encroaching flames. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might be gaining the upper hand. But then the wind shifted, sending embers flying into the dry brush beyond the firebreak. Panic rippled through the crowd as people realized the fire was spreading again. Marcus grabbed his megaphone, his voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone, stay calm. Keep moving toward the evacuation zone. Do not stop, and do not go back for anything." His words carried authority, but he could see the fear in their faces. Families clung to each other, their eyes darting between the fire and the distant safety of the evacuation zone. Marcus felt the weight of their lives pressing down on him, every decision carrying unimaginable stakes. Then, amidst the chaos, he saw something that made his heart stop. A group of children huddled together near an abandoned car, their faces streaked with soot. They looked too scared to move, their small bodies frozen in place as the flames crept closer. Marcus bolted toward them, his mind racing. "It's okay, kids," he called out, trying to sound calm despite the rising terror in his chest. "I'm here to help." The oldest of the group, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "We were looking for my brother," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. Marcus knelt down in front of them, keeping his voice steady. "We're going to find him, but first, I need to get you all to safety. Can you trust me?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. Marcus quickly assessed the situation. The fire was closing in, and the car they were hiding behind was about to become a death trap. He needed to move them now. "All right, everyone, hold hands and stay close to me," he instructed. He led them away from the car, his body acting as a shield against the embers swirling in the air. But as they moved, the girl tugged on his sleeve. "There he is," she shouted, pointing toward a small figure near the edge of the flames. Marcus's stomach dropped. The boy was standing frozen, his tiny frame silhouetted against the raging fire. There was no time to think. He told the other kids to stay put with the nearby volunteer and took off toward the boy, his heart pounding. The heat was suffocating, the fire dangerously close. Marcus could feel the sting of embers on his skin, but he kept going. He reached the boy and scooped him up, turning just as a section of burning debris crashed down behind them. The path back was cut off. Marcus's mind raced as he looked for another way out. The flames were closing in, and the smoke was so thick he could barely see. He activated his radio. "I need immediate assistance at the south perimeter. I've got a child, and we're trapped." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, full of urgency. "Air 1 is diverting to your location. Hold tight, Chief." But Marcus knew they didn't have time to wait. He spotted a narrow gap between the flames and decided to take the risk. Holding the boy close, he made a break for it, the fire licking at his heels. Just as he cleared the gap, the sound of the helicopter's rotors filled the air. Water rained down, dousing the flames and giving him the opening he needed to reach safety. He collapsed onto the ground, the boy still in his arms, both of them coughing from the smoke. The crowd erupted in cheers as they realized what had happened, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind was already racing with the next steps, the next lives to save. As he stood, his eyes locked onto the two officers from earlier. They were watching him, their expressions a mix of awe and something else, perhaps shame. But there was no time to dwell on it. The fire wasn't done, and neither was he. As Marcus stood there, catching his breath and cradling the boy in his arms, the crowd's cheers began to fade into the background. The fire still roared, a constant reminder that the battle was far from over. But something else caught his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that didn't belong. A low rumble, steady and rhythmic, seemed to echo beneath the chaos. He glanced toward the hill where the fire had started. His instincts kicked in, that deep gut feeling that had guided him through countless life-or-death situations. Something was off. The fire's movement didn't match the usual patterns, and the way it had spread so quickly felt almost unnatural. Marcus's brow furrowed as he scanned the scene, trying to piece it together. "Chief Hall, are you okay?" one of his lieutenants asked, jogging up to him. "I'm fine," Marcus replied, his voice distant as he kept his eyes on the horizon. "But something isn't right here. This fire, it's behaving differently." The lieutenant followed his gaze, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. "You think it was deliberate?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but years of experience told him to trust his instincts. "Maybe. I don't know yet, but we need to figure it out." Just as he finished speaking, his radio crackled to life again. "Chief Hall, this is Engine 24. We found something near the origin point. Looks like a device. Could be an incendiary. Marcus's stomach tightened. An incendiary device. That would mean someone had intentionally started this fire. He grabbed the radio and responded quickly. Secure the area and wait for my arrival. Don't touch anything. His mind raced as he handed the boy off to a paramedic and turned to his team. I need a few of you with me. We're heading to the source. The two officers from earlier stepped forward, their expressions serious. Chief, let us come with you, one of them said. Marcus hesitated, but he could see the sincerity in their eyes. They were trying to make amends, to prove themselves. With a curt nod, he motioned for them to follow. The group made their way toward the hill, the heat intensifying as they approached the fire's origin. When they arrived, Marcus saw the crew from Engine 24 standing a safe distance from a small, scorched area. In the center, partially covered by ash, was a metallic object that looked out of place. It's rigged with some kind of timer, one of the firefighters explained, pointing to the device. We didn't want to get too close without backup. Marcus crouched down, inspecting the device from a distance. It was sophisticated, far beyond the usual tools of an amateur arsonist. Whoever had set this up knew what they were doing. This wasn't random, he said, his voice grim. Someone wanted this fire to spread, and they knew exactly how to make it happen. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. But why? What's the motive? One of them asked. Marcus stood up, his jaw tightening. That's what we're going to find out. But first, we need to make sure there aren't more of these devices out there. Just as he spoke, another explosion echoed in the distance, followed by a new column of smoke rising into the sky. Marcus's heart sank. The fire wasn't just spreading, it was being controlled. We need to evacuate the rest of the area immediately, he said, grabbing his radio. All units be advised. This fire appears to be deliberate. Check for additional devices and report any suspicious activity. The team sprang into action, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than anyone realized. He looked at the officers, his voice firm. I need you two to help coordinate with law enforcement. If this is arson, we're dealing with a criminal who doesn't care about the lives they're putting at risk. The officers nodded, their earlier hostility replaced by a newfound determination. They disappeared into the chaos, leaving Marcus to focus on the task at hand. As he worked, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. The fire's location, the sophisticated device, the perfectly timed explosions. It all pointed to something more sinister. But who would go to such lengths? And why target this community? Just then, his radio crackled again. Chief Hall, we've got a problem. One of the evacuees says they saw someone near the first device before the fire started. A man in a dark jacket, carrying a backpack. Marcus's blood ran cold. Did they get a good look at him? Not really, the voice replied. But they said he was moving fast, like he didn't want to be seen. The description was vague, but it was a start. Marcus relayed the information to the officers, hoping they could track down the suspect before more damage was done. As night fell, the fire continued to rage, its glow casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Marcus stood on a ridge, surveying the scene with a heavy heart. The stakes had never been higher, and the answers he needed felt just out of reach. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a battle against nature. It was a battle against someone who had turned the fire into a weapon. And Marcus wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth.